We're going to be picking back up in the 13th book of Yisrayl, part 1, Gold, Purifying Gold. And we're going to be in chapter 23 this evening, which is found on page 243. And before the sun sets here, I'm going to take advantage of it and ask you, what day of the Omar is it? 12. All right, you guys are sharp. Nice. We'll be changing soon, but yes, we're in the 12th day of the Omar. The great feast is soon upon us. It's just like it was written in Scripture, from one Sabbath to another, and from one feast to another, and one new moon to another, we'll all gather together. Praise Yahweh that these gatherings for our building here. We're going to be learning tonight in chapter 23 of the 13th book of Yisrayl, part 1. The title of this sermon Pastor gave on May 25th, 2013 was The Tree of Life and Yeshua Messiah are taught from Genesis 1 clear through to Revelation 22. Okay, and if you haven't checked the front of your book of Yahweh and the back of your book of Yahweh lately, or your Bibles if you're still using a Bible, you know that's the entire Scriptures, okay? The entire Scriptures, the Tree of Life and Yeshua Messiah are taught in the entire Scriptures. The pastor says here in verse 1 on page 243 of your 13th book of Yisrayl, part 1, Shalom everyone. Let's do it big, okay? Okay, you ready? Joyful cheering and praise to Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. You may be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. Okay, remember this peace of Yahweh. This is what Yahweh is bringing us here to learn this peace here at His house so that we'd be able to teach others how to partake of this same peace here. We're going to jump down here to verse 4. And Pastor says, and here are the wars we're having now. We've had 237 wars since 1900. And deaths from those wars were 95,890,838 people. Okay, so just in the past about 100 years, 113 years there at the time of this sermon, you know, we know that number's probably gone up significantly since 2013. But the deaths was 95,890,838 from 237 wars just in the past 100 years. Okay, and it's not just in the past 100 years that wars existed. If you read history, the history of mankind, you can start right there in your Scriptures, and you can see that mankind has partaken of war, you know, almost since the very beginning, you know, with Cain and Abel, you know, where Cain chose that way of war, and he set out that pattern of rebellion, which would lead the world into this continual war. Pastor says, now if you can absorb all this, and you can see then what our world is doing right now, what it's come to from the time of creation. Now in the same time period, now remember this isn't the way Yahweh created mankind. He didn't create them to fight in war. If you remember for your notes in Genesis chapter 4, Genesis 4 and verse 6, Yahweh said to Cain, why are you angry? Why are you downcast? So you can see Cain was not rejoicing, okay? He didn't have the face of Yahweh shining upon him. If you do righteousness, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do righteousness, sin is crouching at your door. The desire to sin is with you, but you must overcome it. Okay, so Yahweh showed here that the desire to sin was with Cain. Okay, it's with mankind, that carnal desire. Remember, we're given this carnal mind so that we could prove and qualify for these great positions Yahweh wants to give us. But He said you must overcome it, which means it's possible to overcome it. Now, in the same time period, Pastor says here, continue on verse 4, page 243, in this last generation, that is, we've come down to this right here. This is what the world is. Okay? And look around what you see, just as the Savior said, you know, with the wars and the unlawful lusts, and sin is reaching its peak. Okay, it's coming to its fullness. And in verse 5, Yahweh has started a work in this last generation. Okay, when did the last generation begin? Who remembers? When did the last generation begin? Shout it out. 1934. Okay, praise Yahweh. 1934. Remember, in 1934, there was the patent of the computer, the patent of the nuclear bomb, and the birth of Yahweh's last day's witness, Yisrael Hawkins, the seventh Malach, the brother of Jacob, the sixth Malach. Yahweh has started a work in this last generation that is going to turn this whole thing around to peace, to a peaceful solution that will bring peace, joy, love to everyone on and in every planet in the universe. Praise Yahweh. Okay, so remember the purpose right here, the peaceful solution, is going to bring peace, joy, and love to everyone in every planet in the universe. Okay, and this is this work Yahweh has started in this last generation that's going to bring peace. So we men have to be partaking of this peaceful solution. If you turn on to page 244, we have to be partaking of this peaceful solution. We have to be practicing it. We have to be practicing in our day-to-day lives with our brothers, with our family members, and even we have to be practicing this when we're out amongst the world. There was a news article I saw briefly, it was either the other night or one day this week, where there was some news reporter or news anchor, that got caught on some camera, belittling somebody that she thought she was better than, and it kind of makes me think about what Pastor said years ago about how the courts of heaven are watching us. It's like they have a bunch of televisions and they're watching what we're doing, and what are we showing, Are we just practicing the peaceful solution when we come to the sanctuary, when we come to Yahweh's house? Or are we actually practicing the peaceful solution in our everyday life, thinking of it constantly? Because this is what's going to bring peace, joy, and love. Okay? Yahweh's laws are the peaceful solution. The peaceful solution are the guide, the steps, the techniques, so you can practice Yahweh's laws and have this peace. And so we really have to be examining ourselves and getting out all the negative traits that still lie within us, constantly, and even as the Sabbath rolls around, this is the day of preparation. We should be preparing for our confessions along with preparing for the Sabbath, and thinking about where we fell short and what we need to do better, and then next week we got to push forward and doing better, and getting out this sin. And remember what Pastor said. He said the time to get sin out is not next week, next month, maybe after Pentecost. No, he said the time to do it is now, and that was a while back when he said that. But the time to get sin out of our lives is now. We have to stop it, nip it in the bud, get it out of our lives right now, or it's going to hold us back from receiving these positions, and we're not going to be able to erase the footage in the courts of heaven, of our actions and our interactions. Now, continuing on here on page 244 and verse 11, Pastor says, in 6 months, they won't want to pick up those weapons again. Okay, and he's talking here, if you look back in verse 10 there, towards the bottom, he says, we have the peaceful solution, okay? We ran the ad, we told all nations to lay down their weapons, and that there's a peaceful solution that we can show them. And he said he's writing another article to show them how they can actually take every nation. Each nation can sign a truce for 6 months, give us the opportunity to preach to all nations, all the teachers of the nations, yes, praise Yahweh, and in 6 months, they won't want to pick up those weapons again. Now that's what I'm saying, in 6 months. If they can get this out, the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program, out to everyone, all the teachers in the world, and they teach it. Okay, and think about what mankind accomplishes in 6 months. I think it took them 6 months to get this P5+1 group of nations together to try to come out with a plan, to supposedly bring peace, with one nation. Now, Pastor's showing here that in 6 months, if this is taught to all the nations, taught not to pick up their weapons and be fighting, in 6 months they can get this out. They can get out the wars and the fighting. And that's how quick Yahweh's way works. And just look at what Yahweh's shown through his plan here, where he's allotted 6,000 years for mankind to go their own way. And then in 1,000 years, he's going to clean it all up and restore the earth back to its original glory. Okay? Using the sons of men. Continuing on here in verse 12. Now, we've had some feedback already on one leader. I won't tell you who he is because I don't want the enemies after him just until we get him built up to where he can withstand their baloney. But he said, I can guarantee you under my leadership there's not going to be abortions or homosexuals. Homosexuality taught in the schools. Praise Yahweh, applause. So there's people in the world who are still eating pork, who are still going to church on Sunday, but they realize the decline of morality where in the schools children are taught and it's promoted for them to partake of abortions, partake of homosexuality, the pleasures of this lifestyle. And many people are turning against this, and they're desiring the answer to stop this confusion. And they see when they're presented with the peaceful solution, they see the answers to stop this confusion. They readily accept it, and they can get behind it, and they can push forward into it and promise that there's not going to be any abortions or homosexuality under their leadership taught in the schools. So we're getting quite a great response to this, and this in a 24-hour period. Now, this is really great, and that was 24 hours since that article was published. This is really great. To me, it's really great. Now, with the world going on in these wars here, you can pretty much see that the world, which the prophecy shows is being led by the Catholic Church, has been since the days of Nimrod. Okay, so Abelin, supposedly like Abelin's run by a couple of the universities, and it's not Catholic universities, but no, the whole world is being led by the Catholic Church. And if that's impossible, you might think, man, that's impossible. How can that be so? Well, go look at the whole world. When do they worship? They worship on Sunday. That was ordained by the Catholic Church. Who do they pray to? They pray to God and Jesus Christ. That was ordained by the Catholic Church. And they'll even admit, some of those things crept in, from the Catholic, but we're different than the Catholic Church. Baptists think they're different than Catholics, and Methodists think they're different than Baptists and Catholics. But you can see it's this whole group of this system of Nimrod, and that's where the system started, the Nimrod school of rebellion, which said we'll rule by force, not by choice, but by force. Okay, and you can see in these last days, Yahweh's allowing his witness Yisrayl to set up this system of Yahweh, okay, where it's being trained and taught that you're not going to rule by force, you're going to rule by teaching. Okay, you're going to teach others not to do certain things, and you're going to teach them that if they do those things, they're going to bring these curses or consequences upon themselves. We'll force them to do what we want them to do. This is the Nimrod system. They're going to force them. Well, of course, this has been going on now for right at 5,000 years. This trying to rule by force, and it doesn't work. And right now we've increased, the war supplies have increased to where it's like Satan. She wants to destroy humanity along with the planets that govern the earth. You remember, which is what Yeshua said, unless heaven and earth pass away. So her desire is to make heaven and earth pass away. Okay? Because she wants Yahweh's plan to fail. Okay? But we know Yahweh's going to step in. He's going to stop this. He's not going to allow the heavens and the earth to be destroyed. He's allowing them to be defiled by mankind. He's allowing them to prove that their way doesn't work, but he's not going to allow them to destroy it. Because if that took place, then we wouldn't have the opportunity to teach others how to stop sin, and we wouldn't have the opportunity to live. We'd all be dead. So Satan wants to destroy humanity, though, along with all the planets that govern the earth, which we see in Genesis 1, that certain planets, the earth was built for a certain purpose, and those planets that govern this earth. Okay, so you see how everything works together. The planets that orbit in our solar system, they weren't just, extra, I don't know, that place is too hot, that place is too cold. No, these are all working together. It's a perfect plan Yahweh set here. And these planets govern the earth, which we see in Genesis 1, that certain planets, this earth was built for a certain purpose, and those planets that govern this earth, she wants to destroy those too, and Yahweh is going to show that she can do it. Through mankind. He's wanting to show this, and he's putting us on exhibit, and that's exactly what's taking place. Okay, so we see that all creation here was built for a certain purpose, and Satan wants to destroy it along with all humanity. That's her desire. So when you give in to sin, when you give in to unlawful lust or unlawful desires, you let the carnal mind rule your thinking. You let hatred and jealousy and rage rise up within you. Fighting and contention, you allow those things to come forth from you. You're partaking of Satan's way. You're partaking of this. You're proving exactly what she wants you to prove. That, wow, mankind, they're losers. They can't handle this position. But men, we have to really remain strong and faithful, okay, in our studies and in the doctrines of the House of Yahweh, and staying tethered. Think about tethering the donkey's colt to the choicest vine. Okay, now think about when you tie something off, especially on some of these winds we've been having. You're not just going to tie it loosely. You're going to get it nice and tied on. We have to remain that tight to pastures or Hawkins, or we're going to get caught up in Satan's way. We're going to fall into this Nimrod system. We're going to become losers, and fools. We're going to go back into sin, go back to the ways of Egypt. But it is possible. It is possible, men, and we see at the feast, it's a great joy to rejoice with our brothers, and we see the righteous desire in the men of Yahweh, okay? And then you men are going to prove Satan wrong. You're going to prove her system wrong, and you're going to prove Yahweh's way does work. Because Yahweh took us from the dirtiest of the dirties, even as Pastor said, he came from Oklahoma, Nothing from Oklahoma was considered anything of value. I don't know why they just didn't exclude that state, but Yahweh allowed it to be that way. But Yahweh's taken the lowest, and, as the scripture says, to confound the wise. Okay, these great scholars and doctors and professors and smart people and scientists, and it's so amazing by every time they think they're fixing a problem, they just create like 10 more problems. This is messed up, so they're going to fix it like this, and then just 10 other problems occur. It's just like their prescription drugs. You take a pill for one problem, and you get 10 other problems, 10 other side effects. And that's about every fix in the world. That's every fix in Satan's system, this Nimrod system, this teaching of the Catholic Church. That's what occurs when you partake of sin. You think, well, I got to sin to do this. I have to get that done, I got to break the Sabbath because I got to make that extra paycheck, or I got to, I got to eat this food and I don't know where my salt is. Whatever it might be, and you try to justify having to sin, well, there again it proves that you haven't resisted that desire, that inclination. You haven't stood strong for the way Yahweh is set, and you gotta get back on track. To praise Yahweh for the confessions. You confess and you pick yourself back up and you push forward. A righteous man falls 7 times or 70 times 7, but he's going to get back up. He's going to get back on that plow and, push that mule forward and keep on doing the job. Now, continuing on here on page 245, in verse 17, Pastor says, the house of Yahweh. Yahweh Himself is the only one who has an answer to this problem. Okay, we need to remember that when we have problems, whether it's in our thinking, the way we're reasoning, or in our actions, in our day-to-day actions, and we have to turn to Yahweh. If we can't find a solution to something, we need to go to the priest, go to our counselors. Even the priests have counselors. You go and you seek counsel, so you can make the right choice, and so you don't fall back into that rut of sin, that pattern of carnality, because sometimes if you really start like listening to your, this Peace Solution talks about self-talk. If you really start listening to yourself sometimes, yourself will try to convince you that you have to do something wrong, or, this way is the right way. And then you wonder, why do I keep following that same trap? Why do I keep making that wrong choice over and over? Well, because you're listening to yourself, which is telling you to do the wrong thing, and at times you have to be humble enough to tell yourself to hush up, be quiet, and you got to stop that self-talk of the negative thoughts that are coming to mind, and you got to go seek Yahweh's guidance. Okay, because right here, Pastor shows it right here in verse 17. Yahweh Himself is the only one who has an answer to this problem. Praise Yahweh. And of course, it's being sought for right now by a lot of people, as you can tell. And more, as the word spreads, more and more will. I want you to turn back to Genesis. More and more will turn to this way. And we will see that 2 billion people will be saved out of this mess. It's not something instant. It's not something that's going to take place overnight, but it can and will. And what we're going to save is about 2 billion people. And a lot of people have a hard time grasping that. If you turn to page 246, a hard time grasping how this small group is going to lead and guide 2 billion people. Okay, but Yahweh has a plan for this to take place. Now we can disbelieve the prophecies. Be naysayers and turn back to the ways of Egypt and go back to eating pork and celebrating Christmas and falling into unlawful acts. Or we can believe all the prophets have spoken, get behind this work, humble ourselves, partake of this training, and we're actually going to be used to lead and guide these 2 billion people. And that's a promise from Yahweh, man. And praise Yahweh that the men of Yahweh are being strong to overcome sin, to fight the carnal temptations, and to push forward and being the teachers Yahweh wants them to be. Praise Yahweh. In verse 19 it says, now that's what the purpose is. The purpose is to make mankind just like Yahweh, to be the Yahweh family, and then Yahweh would use His family. And remember what the prophet Isaiah said, where the prophet Isaiah wrote, where Yahweh said, my ways are not your ways are not my ways. Okay, so Yahweh is training us to be just like Him. What we come with when we come to Yahweh, when Yahweh calls us to His house, we come with carnal thinking. Years of Christianity, and even for some who maybe were born here in Yahweh's house, you still have that genetic Christianity inbred within your mind,
okay, that gets you to thinking that you know. You know, I like how children sometimes you try to tell them something, like, I know. You know, but really we don't know anything, okay? That's what we have to get ourselves to the point where we're so humble to realize we don't know anything and we have to be taught and led. That's why Yahweh sent us and called us to His house to be led by His righteous teacher. You know, so we got to take these books, okay, take these sermons, and we got to start to learn. You know, and never think that you've learned all you can learn, because many people do that. Well, pastor's done taught me everything I can be taught. Now I'm going to Rome, see what the Pope can teach me. You know, people get that foolish in their thinking where they think they've learned everything that pastor knows. You know, and it's not in this sermon, but recently, whether it was on a radio program or one of the classes we went over in workshops or in law class here, pastor was talking about how far Yahweh is ahead of us. You know, and then the great Khan said in the Mujah class a couple weeks before feast, how far pastor is ahead of us. You know, and there's always going to be that gap. We're never going to be catching up where we're going to be equal and know as much. No, we're always going to be learning, and we have to be able to be humble to realize that we don't know and we need to be taught. And that's why we come here to Yahweh's house, to be taught. And Yahweh would use His family. He would give them authority. This is back in verse 19 on page 246. He would give them authority that is much higher than the Malachim, because they're proving they can be trusted. If you go down to verse 20, now 7 works were planned to bring forth sons and daughters for this purpose. The tree of life was presented in each one of these plans. It was presented in each one of the 7 works. And Yahweh says He will have no other work but the 7 works, or no other works but the 7 works. He's got planned, which were the last one, the 7th work, the western lamp that never goes out. It's going to bring forth to mankind the fruits of the tree of life, which will be Yahweh's. Okay, so remember that Yahweh's last day's work is bringing the fruits of the tree of life. Okay, this that was set in the beginning, that this is the tree of life and this only you must partake of. You know, and this is what Pastor's showing us. He's not like a Christian preacher. You know, when you come to Yahweh's house, it's way different than Christianity, where it's not like, well, you know, that's not really great for you, but, you know, you can't really stay away from pork, so why try? No, Pastor has strived diligently for 30, 40 years to get us to the point where we can partake of such great foods here in Yahweh's house that are clean and free of pork and blood and defiled and unclean hands. Okay, so we have to be mindful that, you know, everything is a growing process. Okay, so if you feel as if things are moving too slow for you, well, you gotta get yourself slowed down a little bit. Maybe somehow you sped up too quickly, but grow with Yahweh's house and realize that in Yahweh's house, everything is bringing us closer to perfection. You know, and with what Pastor wrote in that latest newsletter, you can see how important it is to be able to have these clean, healthy foods. And you can see why Pastor doesn't say, you know, well, you know, that's not really healthy, but you can't stay away from it, so oh well. No, he says this isn't beneficial for you. You need to stop partaking of it. You need to stop buying that meat with blood in it. You need to stop buying those things. You need to come out from this world and be separate. You know, and for years, many years, we weren't blessed with the great blessings we have today, you know, where we just totally stayed away from just beef, you know, but we did. We just totally stayed away from it. You know, we substituted. It was a miserable time period, but, you know, we survived. We made it through, and now Yahweh's blessed us much more than we could ever expect. If you go on down to verse 41, on page 248, and verse 41 here, Pastor shows right here, he reads, traditionally in the King James Version, it says seasons, okay? The seasons. And in the Strong Concordance, it means appointed time, designated time, season, congregation. It actually means a congregation. Remember, Yahweh said you'll have a holy convocation. A holy convocation, that means a congregation. Have a holy convocation, a holy meeting of people. Okay, so get that right there. Holy convocation means a holy meeting of people. Okay, it's not that you got to have all the dirt off the floor, you know, and you got to seal up all the windows so it can be totally dust-free, so it can be holy. Okay, this isn't holy like the Pope's holy water. No, this is a holy convocation, means a holy meeting of people. Okay, that's why it's so important that we are making ourselves holy by partaking in the teachings of Yahweh's laws, partaking and practicing the peaceful solution. If you go on to page 249 and verse 52, it says, going back up a little bit, it says, to give you this authority, the same authority He has, so you will rule as a family with Yahweh. Verse 52, where I choose to place my name.
That means my authority. And Yahweh has only chosen one place in these last days, man. If you go over the prophecies and you really study, even with the King James Bible, you can see Yahweh only has one work in these last days. He's only set forth this one place, His house, that's called by His name. Just the fact that there's no other groups called the House of Yahweh, and there were no other groups called the House of Yahweh when the House of Yahweh is established. Many people try to throw a sign in their front yard, but Yahweh's house, this is the only place. This is the only House of Yahweh. It was established by the two witnesses, Yisrayl and Jacob Hawkins, and no other group can ever do that again, because we know Jacob is resting until we resurrect him, and Yisrayl Hawkins is going to stay right here and keep doing Yahweh's work. But in verse 52 it says, where I choose to place my name, my authority in these last days, that authority comes straight from heaven. Remember what Pastor said, it's not a magical thing that floats out of the sky. It's the inspiration of Yahweh. This inspiration comes straight from heaven, sitting at the right side of Yahweh, the high priest over the house of Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. You see what a beautiful picture this is when you just put it together. Believe what the prophets have spoken and put it together. And be a believer, man. Put your belief and trust in Yahweh's scriptures and His prophecies and in His house. Yahweh places His name and His authority at the place He chooses. He chooses. Not that man chooses. Not that the Pope chooses. Not that, the lottery, this is the place, let's roll the bingo dice. No, it's at the place Yahweh chooses. If you go on to page 250 and verse 62, in conclusion here, Pastor says, now here's the beautiful part of that. I will get deeper into explaining, but look on down to verse 10. This is speaking of you, so pay close attention. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them. Okay, this is Leviticus 23, verse 10. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Israel means he who rules as Yahweh rules. And when He brings you to His house, He wants to train you to rule as He rules. Yes, praise Yahweh. And you can find out His rule just by reading the Holy Scriptures and seeing what Yahweh is. Okay, so when Yahweh brings us to His house, He wants to train us to govern as He governs. So He brings us to His teacher, who's going to train us to be just like Him. And in verse 72 on page 251, in Revelation 22:14, it says, blessed are those who keep His laws. Keep His, King James Version says commandment. Well, that's righteousness. Blessed are those who practice righteousness. That's the same thing that was taught to Cain. If you do these things, then you will be accepted. And that's what Yeshua is saying here. You will be accepted by Yahweh if you practice righteousness. So men, you got to keep in every day, every situation, every toe that gets stepped on, or person that spits in your face, or whatever test and trial you may face, if you practice righteousness, you will be accepted. And you can only practice righteousness by following the teachings of the house of Yahweh. You can only practice righteousness by practicing the peaceful solution in all situations. And with that, men, I'm out of time. If you will stand, Yahweh bless you, great men of Yahweh. And I'll turn it over to the great priest, the great Kohan, Zephaniah Hawkins.
Praise Yahweh. Shalom, righteous men. You may be seated. Soon to be another great Sabbath day. We're going to continue where the great Comatethia left off, and I'd like just to call your attention to the title of chapter 23 again, if you turn back there on page 243. And, I was thinking about this in preparation for going over this law class here, this sermon, and that the titles, I used to, when we would receive these cassette tapes, many years ago, the title, would always be a great summary of the sermon that was given. And, in looking at this here, and you see the tree of life and Yeshua Messiah are taught from Genesis 1 clear through to Revelation 22. And I know that sometimes, unless we pay very close attention and we're getting the MP3s or going back and rehearsing them and actually seeing the title, then we probably don't get it on a weekly basis. And it just made me think of how important it is when we want to quickly reference a sermon to know the title and have an idea of what was given there. So with that, let's go over back to page 250. And just going to look back here in Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23, we know, lists all the feast days. But what does it begin with? What's the first one there that's listed in Leviticus chapter 23? That's right, it's the Sabbath day. And we're going to see here, we're going to talk about in the last half of this sermon about the Sabbath day. And Pastor goes into Leviticus 23 here, the beginning part with the Sabbath day, but then he also goes into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we just got done celebrating. And he shows it, he connects it to this last day's work. Because the Scripture has, a meaning that you would read it and you'd see about how they kept the Passover, and then all of a sudden it starts talking about the Lamb, and we understand that there's another meaning there about our great high priest. Well, he kind of goes more into depth in how we, the last day's House of Yahweh, fit right into this feast of Passover and unleavened bread. So let's look back here at verse 62. Now here's the beautiful part of that, and I'll get deeper into explaining. But look on down to verse 10. Now this is speaking of you, so pay close attention. Verse 10, speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, speak to the children of Israel. And Israel means he who rules as Yahweh rules. And when he brings you into his house, he wants to train you to rule as he rules. And you can find out his rule just by reading the Holy Scriptures and seeing what Yahweh is. And you know that the workshops we had this past feast, what was one of the things we covered? The attributes of Yahweh. And looking at this royal priesthood, which the purple represents, we looked at the attributes, and we were reminded of the attributes that Yahweh possesses and how we should strive to have these in our lives as well. But verse 10, and now if you look at verse 63 here, speak to the children of Israel, those who want to rule as Yahweh rules, when you come into the land which I am giving you. Now you'd think, okay, well, where is that land that Yahweh is giving us? Was that just something long ago? And here now you see a deeper meaning of the scripture here. Well, if you know, this is not talking now geographically. It's not talking geographically. So what are we talking about? Well, Abraham, had no place to set his feet. Even though he was given all this land, all these hills and mountains and everything, he owned nothing. Yeshua owned 3 houses that we know of. He owned those houses, and yet he had no place to lay his head. The foxes have dens and everything, and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. But there is something that is given that he is speaking of. That was not his at that time, not yours at that time, speaking of us. But it's going to be abundance in abundance. And, just Pastor saying those words there reminded me of a couple scriptures. You can write them down, Yochanan 10:10 and Psalms 66, 10 through 12. And I wanted to read Yochanan 10:10 because, think of how Yeshua said that we would have to give up things in these last days. He who forsakes father and mother and brother and so forth would receive many times over. And you could have said would receive in abundance, because that's what abundance is. It's something, it's of a great quantity. All right? Now, I remember Pastor saying that people were complaining. They were saying, I gave up so much to come to the house of Yahweh. And Pastor said, you didn't give anything up but a bunch of curses out there in that world. And that's the truth. That's, we left all that. But yes, we have made sacrifices. But those will be given, we will receive in abundance. That's the promise that's made to us. Yochanan 10:10, Yeshua said, the thief comes not only to steal, to kill, and to destroy. I have come that they might have life. And this is what we're talking about here with the tree of life and those that qualify. And we're going to see how it's all tied in. The scriptures that tie this last day's work into or with the high priest, Yeshua. And Yeshua said here that they might have life and they might have it more abundantly. That they'd have it more abundantly. And Pastor's already told us if we're, you want a gold planet, it won't do much, but if you wanted it, you could have it. But think of the abundance of joy and the abundance of peace and these type of things that the world is without at this time. the abundance of health and a healthy body and a strong working body and mind and so forth, a clear mind. These are the things in abundance that we can look forward to. Yes, if we want, those physical things, we could have all that as well. But Yeshua said, I've come to give it to you abundantly. Now, verse 66, when you come into the land which I am giving you. And Pastor says here, when you come into the kingdom. When you come into the kingdom. The kingdom of Yahweh. You could put Revelation 22:14 right there, because this is what it's speaking of, and this is what Yahweh is showing that He's bringing us to. So when it says there in Leviticus 23, when you come into the land, He's talking about when we come into the kingdom. Okay, and we'll see a little bit here further. Now look down at verse 68. Revelation 22, verse 12. And behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every man according as his work will be. Assign you a job, in other words. He's going to give you a job. And right now, you're training to work. Well, we see this is, that Yahweh put Yeshua in charge of this. And He's working with the last day's work. And He's going to give us a job. He's going to assign us a job. Now, if you look over on verse 70, right there, kind of in about four lines down, He's the first and the last here, who's going to bring this great plan to a completion here, because He's high priest. And that is a very necessary thing for you, because we have this great high priest between us and Yahweh, who has taken our prayers to Yahweh. He's taken our improvements, our disabilities, everything to Yahweh, and showing how close He is to getting this job done. And we're not talking about building improvements here. We're talking about character improvements. And hopefully we don't have too many of those disabilities that Yeshua has taken there to Yahweh. But, we should be overcoming those things. And He should be going on our behalf with the improvements and how we're overcoming and wanting to push this work forward. He said, I am the first and last, the beginning and the end. And they say, the Christians, well, no use going into that. It's just stupidity anyway. Let's go down and look at verse 74. Look down to verse 74. Now, we just had the feast, the harvest feast. It's harvest time. That was the whole theme. And keep in mind that this sermon was given about 2 years ago, 23 months ago to be exact. Verse 74 here, it says, now go back to Leviticus 23 here. That's our high priest right there. But Leviticus 23, and get verse 10 again. When you come into the land which I am giving you. Now, the reason I know this is us is because we're the first, and these are the first fruits. Just like we talked about all feast long and prior to it, the first fruits. And you reap its harvest. This harvest is going to be reaped, starting with you. He's talking about us. This is actually speaking of us here in Leviticus 23. It's starting with you. None of the rest of them ever fulfilled this. What we're speaking of here, what you are specially made for, you were planned for. You were designed to take this magnificent job that Yahweh is offering you. Yes, praise Yahweh. So when we come into the land, and remember, that's into the kingdom. That's what Yeshua was talking about there in Revelation. I'm the first and last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who have practiced this righteousness, because I'm giving you right now to enter the tree of life, or to the tree of life. And this right is, it's like permission granted, entrance, to go ahead and enter in to the kingdom. And He sits there as your judge on that throne at the right hand of Yahweh. And He's bringing you to that perfection, that golden perfection that we've been singing about. And verse 76, then shall bring a sheaf. That is, a group of people. A group of people. First fruits of the harvest to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf, that's you, in front of Yahweh to be accepted. On the day after the first holy day Sabbath. Now think about this here. On the day after the Sabbath, what does the Sabbath, what takes place on the Sabbath? That's our training. That's our learning, correct? We were taught on the Sabbath day. Now look at the wisdom and knowledge here, the understanding that Yahweh has blessed the last day's witness with. He said, on the day after the first holy day Sabbath, after the Sabbath, after you're trained. After you're trained is what he's saying. And after you're trained on my Sabbaths to be like Yahweh, then you'll be accepted, as he said to Cain. If you do righteousness, will you not be accepted? So, that scripture there, and we know in Leviticus 23 it says, after the first Sabbath day, we start our count, right? We start our count there for the Omer count to Pentecost. Well, after the Sabbath, after we're trained to be like Yahweh, then we're going to see here, we're going to enter into this land, and we're going to see how Yeshua is so much guiding and working with this last day's work. Now let's look here, verse 78. And now look at this beautiful verse, verse 12. And you shall offer on that day, when you wave the sheaf, a male lamb. So there you see the lamb without blemish or defect. Never been anyone else except Yeshua who has done that. So you see the lamb there connected with the sheaf together. They're together. And this is what Pastor has stressed so much in our mind. And we're going to see in the rest of this sermon here that, Yeshua made reference to us, to this last day's work. Let's turn to page 252 and look at verse 81. Well, in Hebrews 1:1, now he says, Yahweh, who at various times in different ways spoke in times past to our fathers through the prophets. And we know, Pastor brought out at Yeshua's memorial, and he's brought out before then about Yeshua being responsible in writing Hebrews. Verse 82, has in these last days, and there again, that shows that it's speaking about us, spoken to us through his Son, last days. Well, when he said last days, that should clue you in to Genesis 49. The last days, this is what's going to take place in the last days. So he's telling you that he's going to have a guide over the house of Yahweh in the last days. And special things are going to take place under this guide, who was without spot, without blemish, perfectly righteous according to the laws of righteousness. No one has been like Yeshua. No one fits that without spot and perfectly righteous other than Yeshua. Okay, now let's look over to verse 87. Right there in the middle, Yachanan 1:1. And we know this speaks about the plan. In the beginning was his plan. He saw to it that nothing was done that was done without his permission, without being according to this plan. So what is taking place right here, the killing, the destruction that you see, it was planned, of course. And we know that Yahweh allowed it. He allowed mankind to run their course. Just as Pastor explained to us that we're running this race right now. And remember, he said he allowed Satan to get way out there. He allowed Satan to get way out there ahead of us. But now we're catching up. And you see these churches, they're closing their doors. They can't get people to come. That system is starting to crumble. It's falling apart. So what has taken place right here, the killing and destruction, it was planned, of course. He made man subject to vanity. And man has followed that vanity. And he says, here's what it's going to bring you. And they obliged. Okay? Satan had her way. And we're going to see, mankind is going to see exactly what sin brings. They're going to see what sin brings. We're going to bring the end of sin. Now let's look at verse 96 on page 253. And you, Yahweh, in the beginning, laid the foundation of the earth. Now we're going to see that the whole reason that the earth was created, it was all for the purpose of this family. All for the purpose of the work that we're doing right now for Yahweh creating a family, Genesis 1:26 and several other verses. That was the whole reason for all the creations of the heaven and the earth, for this plan, Yahweh's plan, to be fulfilled. In the beginning laid the foundation of the earth. That is the purpose for it. That is the purpose of the earth for mankind. He made it for mankind so he could train mankind on his Sabbath days. And they would know that it's him who set them apart for this special purpose, that Yeshua in Revelation 22 says, come on, I'm going to give you a job in Yahweh's kingdom, and you have right to the tree of life. So you see now how Yeshua qualified, and he's sitting at Yahweh's right hand, but he's still making the intercession. He's praying for us, as we're going to see, and he's tied to that tree of life. He's pushing this work forward. He wants to give us this job. Now let's turn to page 254. Let's look at page 254, verse 104. Okay, and this speaks a little bit more about the harvest time, connecting us with the harvest. In Matthew 20, now notice verse 8. So when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, manager of his house, summoned laborers. Well, that's us. We're the laborers. We're the ones in these last days. We're doing this work. Give them their wages, beginning with the first? No, beginning with the last. Beginning with the last. Beautiful words when they're put together. Beginning with the last. And that's how we see Yeshua, he's connected with this last work here. If you go over to Yachanan now, Yeshua, his prayers, Yachanan 17. Now let's read first verse 9. Yachanan 17:9. He says, I pray for them, I do not pray for the world. Well, I don't pray for the world. Now, he's high priest. Remember this. He's high priest over the house of Yahweh. His prayers are going to Yahweh on your behalf. He's not praying for this world. The world is under this plan. They're assigned to go ahead and take care of their things, to do their thing. You've got to make a choice, as we're shown in Deuteronomy. You've got to make your choice, and Yahweh says that he's going to show you what is going to take place. And remember, I guess Pastor says it right here, you go your way as you have chosen, and I'll show you what your end will be. Remember the song of Moshe. He allowed them to go and see exactly what rejecting and doing away with Yahweh's laws would bring. So he's going to let mankind see that. But the choice is there, and we have to choose. It says just in a couple chapters before then, Yahweh put life and death. He encourages all to choose life. He doesn't want anyone to perish, but yet he says the choice is there. Choose life. Verse 106. Okay, here in chapter 17 and verse 9, so remember Yeshua is praying, but he's not praying for the world. And it said that he prayed for the ones that belonged to him, speaking of the disciples, the 12, but he also prays for someone else. Here in chapter 17 and verse 9, now of Yachanan 17:9, he says, I do not pray for the world, period. Now look at verse 20. He says, I do not pray for these alone. Now he was praying for his disciples here. You got that. Verse 20, and if you look at Yachanan 17:20, this prayer here, he was praying for his disciples to finish their work, but he's saying here, I do not pray for these alone. So there was another group that Yeshua was praying for. He's not praying for the world, so he's praying for another group of people here. And this, again, makes me think of the title here, how that tree of life is tied to Yeshua throughout, from Genesis all the way through Revelations. So he's praying for another group of people. His prayers, sitting at the right hand of Yahweh, yes, he's making his prayers known to Yahweh, but not for the world, but he's praying for somebody else besides his disciples, if you see that. And the Scripture shows that unity between Yeshua and the branch, and makes me think of the one in Zechariah. If you have your Scriptures with you, or you want to mark it down, or I'll read it. Zechariah chapter 6:13 is what it is. Zechariah 6:13. It says, He will build the house of Yahweh, he will bear glory, and he will sit and rule on his throne. He will be a priest upon his throne, and the counsel of peace will be between them both, between Yeshua and the branch, Yeshua Hawkins. So they're always connected. Now let's look at verse 110. And he says, now I have given them your laws. And he's opened the seal. Remember, it was sealed. Yahweh told Daniel, seal it up. No one is going to understand it. It's not going to be able to be understood until someone qualifies to remove the seal. And then not only does he remove the seal, but he gives that knowledge to someone. He's opened the seal. He's actually opened the seals, as Revelation chapter 5 and 6 say. I've given them your laws, which means also including prophecy. And no one understands, no one can teach the prophecies but Yahweh's last day's witness. He's given that prophecy. He's been given that understanding, guided by the high priest, to understand the prophecy. Now look at Yochanan 17:17. Sanctify. Sanctify them through your laws. Your laws are truth. Sanctify. Sanctify them through your laws. If you look back to, or remember, just remember this. Remember this. He says, keep my Sabbaths, and they will be a sign that it's me who sanctifies you. And all this ties into the training, and once we're trained, we'll receive. Yeshua is going to give us a job, and what is that job going to be? We're going to see here in just a little bit what our job is going to be. But all these things tie together. Now look down at in the middle of verse 112. Yahweh said, go to the place where I choose to place my authority. That's where you keep the Sabbath. If you don't go to that place, then you're not being sanctified by Yahweh. You're not keeping the Sabbath day. It's plain and simple. There's where you learn to keep the Sabbath. Learn to keep it to perfection. And I'm not talking about if you're not here. I'm saying if you're not connected to this group. If you're not connected to this group, yes, you may be keeping the Sabbath day in your parts wherever you are, but it has to be in accordance with what the house of Yahweh in these last days has taught. Then you're keeping it according to the teachings that come forth from Yahweh's only established work. There's where you learn to keep the Sabbath. Learn to keep it to perfection. The perfection that Yeshua brought, being a servant to the people. Servitude, that's the attitude. And remember the young man that said it's not servitude with an attitude, it's the attitude of servitude. This is what we learn on the Sabbath day. We should have more joy. We should have more joy in bringing joy to someone else. That should be where our joy comes from, when we can bring joy to others. Remember, one of our cooks wrote that servitude, that's the attitude that he put in us, and then I will give them eternal life. And let's turn the page to, I want to get to this part here. Turn to page 256, verse 127. The first part of Yahweh's plan was to make man in his image. Yeshua was the firstborn of many brethren. He was the first to be made into this perfection of Yahweh. The first. A lot of others who are here last, who are being called last, are going to go with him first into the kingdom. Remember, Pastor said beautiful words when you put them together. The first and the last, starting with the last. Beautiful words when you put them together. To receive authority, you see that? The last that he is calling, are going to be allowed with him and given this job. And if you look over, look at the top here, the next page. And of course, our job is to teach the whole universe Yahweh's way. The teaching part there, it reminds me of a sermon Pastor gave it was January of 2004, where he was talking about Psalms chapter 82, and he actually described this family of priests. And if you go back there, you get the definition of a priest, and it was a guide, a counselor, a protector of the food supply. a servant, and so forth, and a teacher ministering to the needs. And that's what it makes me think of when Pastor talks about our job as teaching in the family of priests. It's that guiding and in the constant instruction and meeting the needs. Now let's look down. Let's look over at verse 133. And from this point here, on verse 133, Pastor speaks about Matthew 7, verse 12. And he says, "Therefore, all things you want men to do to you, do the same to them, for this is the teaching of the laws and the prophets." So he puts it upon you now. This is the teaching, and he tells you exactly what Yahweh's laws teach you. Yahweh's laws are teaching you, don't steal, don't kill, don't murder, don't molest, don't lust after your neighbor's property. And he's telling us to live by these words. Would we want these things done to us? Of course not. Then we should not do them to someone else. We need to have this thinking too in how we interact and with others. If we don't want it done to us, let's not do it to someone else. Now, if you don't want him doing this to you, then he's saying, don't do it to him. Do to others as you want them to do to you. And this is the teaching of the laws and the prophets. This is the whole teaching, Pastor says here, that will get you to be like Yahweh. The whole teaching that will get you to be like Yahweh. If you want someone to do it to you, do it to them. All right, now let's look at verse 145. Look over here at verse 145. And then he says, verse 12. Now, he's in Zechariah chapter 6, verse 12. And, that's where we see the connection here with the high priest and the last day's work of Yahweh. "Speak to him and say, this is what Father Yahweh says." In other words, Father Yahweh is giving Yeshua, the high priest, a command. He's giving him a command. He's giving him an instruction. And what he's saying is, behold the Moloch. Behold, your Moloch is what he's saying here. And what is that behold? It's take notice. Pay attention to, guide and instruct and inspire. Yeshua was given that command, behold this Moloch. Behold your Moloch. Behold the man whose name is the branch, for he will branch out from his place, and he will build the house of Yahweh. Now, let's look over at verse 148. But here now Yeshua says, talking directly to his house through Revelation, the last revelation given to mankind, Revelation 22:16, "I, Yeshua, have sent my Moloch." Now, that's speaking of this last day's branch. Speaking of the last day's messenger. That's who Yeshua, you see here, "I, Yeshua, have sent my Moloch." That is, the branch who's given to him, to testify to you these things in the congregations of the house of Yahweh. He's the one who will build the house of Yahweh. He will branch out and build the house of Yahweh in the last days. We're going to have to stop right there. I would encourage all of you to read the last two pages. There's a lot of great information in this sermon.